Next, I am going to welcome our next speaker, Patrick Gorman, Executive Vice President at Booz Allen Hamilton, for a fireside chat sponsor industry perspective. Patrick, welcome and great to have you.
Good morning.
With cybersecurity, as we just heard from Chris earlier, there's such an important aspect that partnerships and collaborations with or even learning from industry are going to play in tackling some of our most pressing cybersecurity challenges. So Patrick, what does a whole of government approach to cybersecurity issues affecting national security look like from your industry perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I think first, sometimes it's always important to back up and understand what the goal is. I think ultimately what we're trying to get to in cyber is some type of deterrent strategy. And to have deterrence, you have to have two things in place, right? One is you have to decrease the reward that an adversary gets by attacking you. And the other part is you have to increase the cost. Once you get that equation right, you can actually start to have a real deterrent strategy. Currently, we, I think, as a government and even as industry, are overweighted on defense. So we're constantly playing defense on this. So, to your question about what does whole of government start to look like, I think it's the integration of offense and defense in a very synchronized way. And by synchronized, I mean common policies, strategies, doctrine, operating models, all the things that I think we have done in the global war on terrorism, things that we did in the Cold War with nuclear deterrence. These are kind of lessons learned of how we should actually conceptually pull all this together. It's something that now is largely fragmented and not too terribly well integrated. To be fair, I think we're getting better, but I think we have a ways to go on that. To me, that's what kind of the whole of government looks like. So that's kind of point one. Point two is our strategy right now is a little bit more weighted towards deter and respond. And it's not necessarily all that proactive in terms of prepare, prevent, and recover. So a lot of it is we detect when we get attacked, we share information, we rally around, we do investigations, FBI comes in, we get Homeland Security, but we don't spend as much time understanding the threat, developing countermeasures, and working collectively with the private sector and the government to actually take down the infrastructure, take down the botnets, and make sure we have the right countermeasures in place. Again, I think we're getting better. We've made a lot of progress, I think, in the last 10 years, but we're not quite there yet. And I think the last piece of this is that we really need to build resiliency into our systems because a lot of it is focused on security and not on the ability to take a hit and keep on going. And I think resiliency is kind of the missing piece of this.
It's really interesting that you mentioned offense and the dichotomy of offense and defense. When we're talking about the national security landscape and cybersecurity, we often think of defense, but really, when you think about it, offense makes sense that you have to kind of be prepared to maintain that resiliency ahead of time. So it's really interesting that you put it in those words.
I regard it to kind of pull that thread a little bit. Look,
Sure.
At the end of the day, we have to impose costs. If we don't impose costs, we're going to be spending more and more on defense, and I think we're going to be on the losing end of the battle. There has to be a balance between offense and defense. And I think Chris has said this before, I think it's going to be a little bit like defense-driven offense, a little bit more. So we defense-informed offense as we do this. So I think it's once it becomes integrated, and once we bring the private sector into that, so we understand what the private sector can do in that model, I think the better off we'll be.
So we've experienced a few cybersecurity issues just in the past year alone, considering the landscape of what we've just been through with the pandemic. They're really complex, but despite this, I know it's your approach that someone shouldn't have a PhD to work with the government on solving these issues. So how do you operationalize this approach?
Yeah, I think first it's important to understand kind of the view from industry and what happens. If I'm regulated, I have to go through a regulator. So if I'm oil and gas, I'll go through energy. Unless I'm using a pipeline, then I'll go through Department of Transportation, which really that's been sourced to the Transportation Security Administration. So you have to understand who is your regulator, but who is really not your regulator, and different parts of what you do, how that is actually regulated. So there's a huge regulatory complexity associated with this one that is very difficult to navigate. The big companies can do it because they have the resources and they can hire former govies to come in and help them do this. These small, medium-sized companies can't do that. And so they're kind of left to their own. Second is to get good intelligence and information out of the government. You usually have to people that came out of, one of the three-letter agencies to help these companies navigate, make the contacts, and bring that expertise to it. And then investigations done by FBI or Secret Service, and then operations are largely done through Homeland Security, and then the various ISACs that are out there. So, and then you have the state and local government that have their own regulatory regimes for coordination mechanisms. So there's a lot going on. And I would argue that complexity is the enemy of speed and agility. And I think what we have is an incredibly complex mechanism by which we have to in the private sector interfaces with the government in terms of what we have to do from regulatory operational intelligence point of view. So I think what we have to do is come up with an integrated operating model. Like, how is this actually going to be operationalized? What are the roles and responsibilities? What are the workflows? Who does what? And I'd also argue that we actually need to start looking at not just things around information sharing, but collaboration. And I think one of the things we learned on the global war on terrorism is that things like the National Counterterrorism Center allowed us to put people next to each other face to face and build those relationships and build collaboration. And I think that's what we're going to have to do with the public and private sector. I don't think it's all done remotely through Zoom calls or through emails. I think some of this can require face to face. I think we need a national cybersecurity center, a physical building by which industry reps can actually occupy and work side by side with the government counterparts. I hate to say this in the digital world, but I think we need more physical co-location to actually make this work.
It's definitely going to be interesting to see how that might play out. Introducing the new national cyber director into a remote world right now, and then how can we really facilitate those collaborations without the challenges of everyone's experiencing, with remote work. So there's so much government can learn from industry, who is also dealing with the same security concerns, and government leaders can reach across those digital walls per se to leverage the best solutions. So government doesn't have to do it alone. That certainly reigns true. So when faced with such grave cyber issues, can you talk through how big corporations handle it, and what can government learn from industry to, in turn, protect its own networks and systems?
Yeah, I mean, first, I think Chris has brought up a really good point. He's going to have a staff of 75, and he's going to leverage other agencies in the government. But he needs a team of teams that involves the private sector. And if you think about the private sector, some basic stats, we spend $60 billion a year on cybersecurity. We have probably 1 million plus cybersecurity professionals throughout financial services, oil and gas, consulting, IT. It is a gigantic army of cyber professionals. That army could be leveraged to basically give the team of teams a huge lift. Second, there's a ton of innovation coming out of Silicon Valley and startups. So venture capitalists spend about $8 billion a year on new cybersecurity startups. That is basically the same amount of money that the U.S. federal government spends on cyber defense for the civil agencies. So that's private sector money coming up with new technologies, new ideas on how to operationalize this. So the ability to tap into that expertise for best practices, the ability to tap into that expertise for new technologies, things like AI, automation, and all this stuff is enormous. I think the government has historically struggled to do that on a consistent basis. I think we bring in private sector, we have meetings, and I think we all learn a lot. But the question is, how do you build that into the day-to-day routine? So you can bring in private sector experts, work side by side with the government, all this. The private sector has done, I think, a really good job of trying to figure out things like governance, roles and responsibilities, risk management, architectures, and how to deploy things and optimize things in a fairly cost-effective way. These are things that should be lifted and shifted into the government, and vice versa. The government's got a lot of lessons learned as well. So I think this flow back and forth between the private sector and the public sector on technology and best practices is I think, key to building a really good partnership going forward.
Fantastic. Well, I know we are right at the end of our time here, but is there any last tips you think that government can address when it's facing its cybersecurity challenges over the next coming year?
Yeah, I think the one thing I would say, I love history. we've kind of been here before. We went through this in the Cold War. We knew how to do integrated air defense, offense and defense together. We went through this in global war and terrorism, how to get the state and local law enforcement, the intel community, all that together. So we know how to do this. I think sometimes we think this is a new world and we have to start from scratch. I think we just kind of look back at what we've done in the past and well, it's not perfect, but start to apply it to what we have to do going forward in cybersecurity.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Patrick. This was a great conversation and a look at how some of these challenges can be solved with the importance of partnerships. So thank you again.
Great. Thanks, Amy. Thanks for hosting this.
Next, we will move on to my colleague, Jackie Medina, who will be introducing our panelists for the Acting on the Executive Order to Improve the Nation's Cybersecurity panel. So off to you, Jackie.